a huge earthquake occurs, causing the tectonic plates to move, which triggers more earthquakes, which causes volcanoes to erupt, which causes the sun to become dark and the moon to turn red. And then you have huge asteroids falling on the earth, wiping out cities and causing catastrophic damage and destruction to the earth. But people, that's not the worst of it. When will Jesus return, and what's the sign that signals his return? So turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 24. Follow along as I read verses 29 through 30. And let me remind you that the rapture and the second coming are two different things. This question has nothing to do with the rapture. The rapture comes as a thief in the night. You don't know when it's coming. There is no sign to let you know. But for the second coming, there is. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. Can't wait to see that happen. I'll be in heaven. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now I want you to notice that Jesus said immediately after the tribulation of those days. The phrase of those days refers to the 2,520 days of the tribulation. Remember, the first half of the tribulation will last for exactly 1,260 days. The second half of the tribulation will also last for exactly 1,260 days, for a total of 2,520 days. If you want to be more specific, it's going to be 7 years in prophetical years. What's a prophetical year? A prophetical year is 360 days. So if you take 7 years times 360 days, you get exactly 7,520 days. 42 months, or times time and a half a time. Yeah. So, according to Jesus, he will return immediately after the tribulation. The word immediately is translated from the Greek word eutheos. And eutheos means without delay or lapse in time. So the phrase immediately after means that Jesus will return as soon as the tribulation is over. He will not return before the tribulation is over, and he won't delay his return for several days after the tribulation has run its course. No, the tribulation will last for exactly 2,520 days. No more than 2,520 days. No less than 2,520 days. And immediately after those days, Jesus will return. Immediately after. But what will it be like on this earth right before he returns? Because if I want to recognize the sign, I want to know what the conditions are on this earth. Well, look back at verse 29 and let's find out. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, as you can see, Jesus is describing the setting for his return. In other words, what is it going to be like on this earth at the very end of the tribulation? What are the conditions? Why? This is kind of interesting. You get to the very end of the tribulation, what's it going to be like? Well, the sun will be darkened. The moon won't give its light. The stars will fall from the sky. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but Jesus has just described in layman's terms the very same conditions that John described in the book of Revelation. Let me say that again because it's very important. Jesus has just described in layman's terms the very same conditions that John described in the book of Revelation. John goes into more detail than Jesus, but Jesus is describing the very same thing. In fact, if you don't mind, let me elaborate on some of the events that John mentioned in the book of Revelation and how they're going to produce the effects that Jesus is describing. First, Jesus said the sun will be darkened and the moon won't give its light. That's the effect the fifth bow will produce when it's poured out upon the earth. Look at Revelation chapter 16, verse number 10. Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was plunged into darkness, and the subjects ground their teeth in anguish. Now, once the kingdom is plunged into darkness, it stays that way until Christ returns. And that's a good thing to remember, because once the earth is plunged into darkness, the sun remains darkened until Christ returns. And of course, the moon gets its light from the sun. So if the sun is darkened, then the moon can't shine. Everyone with me? So what Jesus is describing is the effect caused by the fifth bowl being poured out upon the earth. Secondly, Jesus said that the stars will fall from the sky. And once again, he's describing the cause and effect of the sixth seal being opened in the book of Revelation. In other words, when the sixth seal is opened, a polar axis shift occurs and the stars fall from the sky. Not stars like the sun, but asteroids and meteorites. I'll prove that to you in just a moment. Turn to Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 17. I'll show you what I'm talking about. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell into the earth. Now, really, that's not a good translation. We would say it this way: and the stars of heaven fell to the earth. Even as a fig tree casteth her untimely fig, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Sorry, I don't eat breakfast before I get up here, but anyways. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, in other words, everyone, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Now, let me ask you a question. If you saw these things happening today, what would you think? What would you think? You would think that the world was coming to an end. Yeah. And people, that's the whole purpose of this seal. To warn those who are living on the earth that the world is coming to an end. This is a warning that God is getting ready to bring an end to the sinful world and to set up his kingdom upon this earth. But it's not the end yet. In fact, we're just about 21 to 24 months into the tribulation when the sixth seal is opened. But when those on the earth see these things happening, they'll think it's the end of the world. In fact, they'll wish that it was, but it won't be. So let's look at what happens when the sixth seal is opened. Let's look at verse number 12 again. Remember, this is Revelation chapter 6. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. So the sixth seal starts with the great earthquake. And I want you to underline that phrase, great earthquake, in your Bible. That phrase is translated from the Greek words megas, seismos, which literally means huge earthquake. Let me do my Trump impression. Huge earthquake. In fact, our English word mega is transliterated from the Greek word megos, and it means huge. And our English word seismo, which means earthquake, is transliterated from the Greek word seismos. So this is a mega earthquake, bigger than the earth has ever seen before. It is going to be so big that it's going to cause a polar axis shift, which I'll explain in detail in just a minute, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. This earthquake is going to be so big that it will be felt worldwide. It'll go off the charts on the Richter scale. The tectonic plates will move, triggering more earthquakes and causing volcanoes to erupt and activating previously dormant volcanoes. These volcanoes are going to spew vast quantities of ash, dust, steam, and gases into the sky, causing the sun to be darkened and the moon to appear blood red. But people, that's just the beginning. Look at verse 13. Same chapter, Revelation chapter 6. Verse 12, now we're looking at verse 13. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Now the word stars is translated from the Greek word aster. Our English word asteroid comes from this Greek word. In fact, did you know that asteroids are the source of all meteorites? Or not all, but most meteorites. It's true. So asteroids and meteorites are going to be falling on the earth like fruit falls from a tree on a real windy day. Now, this is the same Greek word that Jesus used when he said in the Olivet Discourse that stars will fall from the sky. He used the Greek word aster. So he's not referring to stars like the sun, he's referring to asteroids, just like John was in the book of Revelation. So I want you to get a picture in your mind of what's going to happen. A huge earthquake occurs, causing the tectonic plates to move, which triggers more earthquakes, which causes volcanoes to erupt, which causes the sun to become dark and the moon to turn red. And then you have huge asteroids falling on the earth, wiping out cities and causing catastrophic damage and destruction to the earth. But people, that's not the worst of it. These catastrophic events will cause a polar axis shift. Now, does everyone know what a polar axis shift is? It doesn't do any good for me to tell you that it's going to cause a polar axis shift if you have no idea what that is. So does everyone know what a polar axis shift is? You do? Most people don't? All right. Let me see if I can explain it to you. The earth is like a gyroscope spinning on an axis. The axis that it's spinning on is called the polar axis because it's in line with the north and south poles. In other words, think of the axis as an imaginary line that extends through the north and south pole. And that's what the earth is spinning on. In fact, I brought this up for you to see. If you notice, every globe looks just like this. It's tilted a little bit. The axis is always running here. It's always running through the North Pole and the South Pole so that it can spin on this axis. So there's this imaginary line that goes through the North Pole, down through the South Pole, and the Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees. And it spins on that axis. Everyone with me? Yeah. All right. Now the earth is tilted, as I said, at 23.5 degrees on its axis as it rotates around the sun. That's why we have different seasons throughout the year. As the earth revolves around the sun, the northern and southern hemispheres either move closer to the sun or further away. In fact, let me just show you this because you might not know. Let's suppose that this is the sun and we are thousands of miles, millions of miles, or whatever miles away. Now, if you notice, this is the earth and it's going to spin around the sun. If you notice, when it's like this, if this is flat, it's tilted 23.5 degrees, it's summertime right now for those in the southern hemispheres. Why? Because they're closer to the sun. It's wintertime for all those in the northern hemisphere. Why? Because they're further away from the sun. Now, we know that the earth revolves around the sun. It revolves how? Clockwise or counterclockwise? Good job, counterclockwise. So I should go this way, but I'm not going to go this way because I want you to see. So now we're looking at the northern hemisphere, and at this point, it's in the wintertime. The southern hemisphere is in summertime. When it revolves around the sun in 6 months over here, now all of a sudden we have something different. That in the northern hemisphere is closer to the sun, and that in the southern hemisphere is further away from the sun. So in the southern hemisphere, they're experiencing winter. We're experiencing summer. That's why we have our seasons, because the earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees. So when it revolves around the sun, we go from winter to summer. And of course, we have those seasons in between because it's slowly changing. And our favorite time of year is what? The fall. Because it's football season. Yeah. Now, the polar axis of the earth is pointed towards the North Star. Does everyone get that? This axis that's running through here, if you took this imaginary line, this axis points where? To the North Star. And it continues to point towards the North Star as it revolves around the sun. Again, that's why we have different seasons. It's because it doesn't wobble as it revolves around. It continues to be pointed towards the North Star at all times. Now, how many of you remember the tsunami that hit Sri Lanka on December 26, 2004? I know it was a long time ago, 2004. But how many of you remember that? I think they even made a movie about that. It was a fictitious movie, but it was based on it. It was caused by a massive earthquake that measured a 9 on the Richter scale. 170,000 people were killed in Sumatra, 31,000 in Sri Lanka. What's interesting is that earthquake that triggered that tsunami was said to have caused the earth to wobble. Not enough to feel, but enough to measure. Now, when I say wobble, I'm talking about the polar axis moving from its tilt of 23.5 degrees. So when this earthquake happened and it caused this tsunami, we're tilted at 23.5 degrees. It caused the earth to wobble a little bit. Did you know that? Not enough for us to feel, but enough for us to measure. Yeah. Now, when I say wobble, I'm talking about the polar axis moving from its tilt of 23.5 degrees. And that's what a polar axis shift is. It's when the polar axis shifts. And the earth is either tilted more than 23.5 degrees or less than 23.5 degrees. Now, can you imagine what that would do? It would create a dramatic climate change, to say the least. It would literally turn the world upside down. So all you climate changers, good Lord. Well, you don't believe science, Pastor Allen? Of course I believe science. Let me tell you, the earth has always changed its climate, but you hadn't seen true climate change until this takes place. I'll go a little bit further. Well, the science says all of the science is being conducted by research universities. In fact, how many of you watch Big Bang Theory? Have you noticed that those on Big Bang Theory never teach? You want to know why they don't teach? They're research professors at these universities, so they don't teach, they do research. And in order to be able to do the research, they have to get grants. So they get this grant money in order to do this research. But if they disprove what they're researching, then the money dries up and goes away. So guess what? You can't disprove it, people. You might change it and then go a different way, but you got to keep it coming. Let me just give you a little saying to help you out with this world. Figures don't lie, but liars figure. Who you want actually reading the research are those who don't have grant money tied to it. Yeah. Oh, worried about climate change. Let me tell you, climate change is coming. It's coming in the last 7 years, and we're living in the end times. I think it's going to come in the next 15 to 20 years when we're out of here and 7 years comes and we're about 21 to 24 months and the sixth seal happens. You're going to see true climate change when the earth begins to wobble, when that polar axis shifts. Now, how do I know that a polar axis shift is going to occur when this great earthquake hits? Well, look at verse number 14. Revelation chapter 6. We're still reading about the sixth seal. Look at verse 14. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now that's really not a good translation. Let me show you why I say that. First of all, the word departed is translated from the Greek word apokorizo, and it means to split or to part. So what John was saying is that heaven was split like a scroll. So I want you to picture heaven as a scroll. Now look back at verse number 14. I want you to underline the phrase, rolled together. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. Underline that phrase, rolled together. That phrase is translated from the Greek word hylisso, which simply means to roll. The picture that John is painting is of a scroll that's being rolled. Not rolled up or out or together, but simply being rolled. You're rolling one end out as the other end is being rolled in. Now, let me illustrate what John was saying. He said that heaven, in other words, the sky, was parted like a scroll and wrote. Now, typically, whenever a scroll was wrote, you wrote one side out and the other side in. So let me just kind of show you with this scroll here. It says heaven is wrote like a scroll. And what that means is, if we hold this up, this is the part of the sky that we see where we're at on the earth. So when we're here in Oklahoma and we look up at the sky, this is what we see. But he tells us when the sixth seal hits, what we see, this sky is going to roll. Do you see it? Doesn't mean one's going to roll all together. It doesn't mean one's going to roll out or this one's going to roll out. It simply says it's going to roll. What you see in the sky will roll. Everyone with me? All right. So that means that the stars that were visible before, wherever you lived, they're no longer visible. Or you have to look somewhere else to see them, because the sky has been rolled like a scroll. And the stars that weren't visible before are now visible. Why? Because the sky's been rolled. There's what I see at night. I look up there and I can see these constellations. But when this polar axis shift occurs, I got to put it down a little more. So I see this. It says when I see the sky rolls. Now what I saw before, I don't see. What I saw before was over here. What I saw before, I no longer see. And what I couldn't see, I now see. Everyone with me? All right. Now, let me ask you I've been a good rodeoer. Let me ask you a question. What would make the sky seem to roll like a scroll? Only one thing. A polar axis shift. That's the only thing that can explain the sky looking like a parted scroll that's being rolled. Still don't believe it? Look at the last part of verse 14. And every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now the word moved, kineo, can mean to move or it can mean to remove. But it really doesn't matter because either one describes the effect of a polar axis shift. When the Earth's axis shifts, most islands will be wiped away. They'll be covered by water. And the ones that aren't will seem like they've been moved. Those in the tropics will seem like they've been moved. Yeah, they'll seem like they're in the Arctic Circle. And those in the Arctic Circle will become like tropical islands, as if they were moved from one location to another. Now, when the sixth seal is opened and the polar axis shift occurs, it will fulfill several of the prophecies in the book of Isaiah. Turn to Isaiah chapter 34, verse 4. And all the host of heaven, what are the host of heaven? Stars. Shall be dissolved. What? Well, just a minute. Let's find out what that Hebrew word means. And all the stars of heaven, host of heaven, shall be dissolved. And the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. And all their hosts shall fall down, as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. Now I want you to underline the word dissolved. Dissolved is translated from the Hebrew word makak, and it means to decay or to rot. Now, when something starts to decay or rot, its cells are actually breaking down. So it is no longer stable. Ever picked up a fruit that's overripe, starting to rot? It's squishy. It's not firm. It's no longer stable. And people, that's what Isaiah is saying. The host of heaven, the stars in the sky, are no longer stable. What does he mean by that? They no longer hold their position. Did they change their position? No. The earth changed. A polar axis shift occurred. So what the stars used to be in the constellation used to be here in the sky, now they're down here. Yeah. Why? because the heavens are being rolled together like a scroll. Now, I want you to underline this phrase here in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 4, rolled together. That phrase is translated from the Hebrew word galal. It simply means to roll. So this is the way it should have been translated. And the heavens shall be rolled as a scroll. That's the very same thing that John saw in his vision in the book of Revelation. Exact same thing. Isaiah went into an open-eyed trance. He sees this vision of heaven. He sees what's going to happen in the end times. Boy, 800 years later, John has his revelation. That's what revelation means. It's a vision. He goes into an open-eyed trance. He sees this vision, and guess what? He sees the very same thing that Isaiah does. When the end times comes, the sixth seal is opened. The heavens roll like a scroll. Now look at Isaiah chapter 24, verse 20. Another verse. The earth staggers like a drunk. The earth staggers like a drunk. It trembles like a tent in a storm. How many of you like to camp out? You get your tent out there and a storm comes in with high winds. You think the tent's going to blow over because it's just doing this. It falls and will not rise again. It falls and will not rise again. For the guilt of its rebellion is very heavy. Why is it coming upon them? This is God's judgment. Last 7 years of the tribulation. Boom. The great earthquake, volcanoes erupting, and asteroids hitting the earth will cause the earth to stagger as if it's drunk, and then it will fall. In other words, the polar axis will shift. Yeah. It will stagger like a drunk, and then it will fall. Wow. Wow. Verses 8 and 9. The fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and the sun was given power to scorch people with fire. They were seared by the intense heat, and they cursed the name of God, who had control over these plagues. But they refused to repent and to glorify him. This plague intensifies the sun's heat. And as a result, it says that they are seared by this intense heat. I want you to underline the word seared because this is important. Seared is translated from the Greek word kaumatizo, which means to be severely burned. This isn't talking about a sunburn, people. This word, kaumatizo, means to be severely burned. We're talking about third-degree burns. A first-degree burn actually causes redness and swelling in the outermost layers of the skin, what we know as the epidermis, the outer layers of the skin. A second-degree burn causes redness, swelling, and blistering, and the damage extends beneath the epidermis to the dermis, the lower layer of skin. But a third-degree burn destroys the entire depth of the skin, causing scarring. If severe enough, it actually damages the muscles. And if you get burned enough, it not only damages the muscles, but also the bones. Here's what's interesting. This word seared in the Greek actually refers to third-degree burns. So the intense heat of the sun is actually giving people third-degree burns. Now notice the response of the people. Instead of repenting, what do? They blame God. And it's true. God's the one who's causing these judgments to occur. And we just read that in verses 8 and 9. God is the one who's doing this. But why is he doing this? He's doing this because of their sinfulness. God is just in judging them and in dishing these judgments out because they are a just recompense for their sin. But instead of repenting, they continue to blaspheme God. Now, if you remember, up until this time, the only one that's been blaspheming God is the beast. Now, I'm not saying that people don't blaspheme God every day, but I'm talking about people as a whole. And as we went through the book of Revelation, up until this point, the only one that's been recorded as blaspheming God is the beast. But now it's not just the beast. The people are now taking on the character of the beast, and they're blaming God just like the beast did, instead of blaming their own sinfulness. Instead of looking at themselves and saying, we're to blame for this. God's doing this because of what we've done. They don't do that. They blame God and they blaspheme him. Verses 10 and 11. The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom was plunged into darkness. Men gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, but they refused to repent of what they had done. Now I want you to notice that this bowl is poured out upon the throne of the beast. The word throne in the Greek is actually thronos. That's where we actually get our word throne. It's transliterated from this Greek word. But it specifically says that this bowl is poured out upon the thronos, or the throne of the beast. And that's very important, because what this is telling us is that it's his kingdom that's affected. Now, some scholars say that the kingdom of the beast is worldwide, so the whole world is going to be affected. But if you remember, 10 kings are going to give the beast their authority, but they will still remain as kings over their kingdoms, which means that the beast kingdom is really a distinct kingdom. Look at Revelation chapter 17. We're going to read verses 10 through 13. If you remember when we were studying the beast, we kind of jumped ahead, and we got a head start in chapter 17 and 18, because chapter 17 and 18 are actually endnotes. It's kind of an appendix to let you know what's going on and what all has happened, and we're going to get there next week when we talk about that. But I want you to understand that we've already looked at this when we were studying the beast. Now notice what it says beginning in verse number 10 in chapter 17. This calls for a mind with wisdom. In other words, this calls for understanding. The 7 heads on this beast are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. The word kings in Greek could mean kingdoms. So they are also 7 kingdoms. 5 have fallen. Do you remember the 5 that have fallen? Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greek. And then he goes on. 1 is. What kingdom existed when John wrote this? Rome, the Roman kingdom. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, and he's referring to when the kingdom does come, the kingdom must remain for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. Now, did you notice what this said? If you didn't, I'm going to kind of sum it up. The beast belongs to the 7th kingdom, the revived Roman Empire. But he's also considered to be an 8th king. In other words, he has his own distinct kingdom. Does that make sense? So he has his own kingdom, and he's over the revived Roman Empire, but eventually he gains control over it all, but he still has what's considered to be his own kingdom. So I personally believe that the 5th bowl is poured out upon the throne of the beast. In other words, it's poured out specifically upon his kingdom, also known as the 8th kingdom. Now, it could be upon the whole world, but I don't believe that. And I'll tell you why. I believe that the 5th bowl is meant to be a testimony to the world. In a sense, it's an object lesson. In order to prove that the kingdom of the beast is a kingdom of darkness, God is going to bring physical darkness upon it. It's what we would call an object lesson. The kingdom of darkness has become dark. In other words, God's getting very specific. If you noticed, he does a lot of explanation as to why these judgments are being poured out. He didn't do that with the seals. He didn't do that with the trumpets. But now when it comes to the last series of judgments, when he turns all of the fresh water into blood, he explains exactly why he does it. You poured out the blood of the saints, I'm going to pour out blood and I'm going to force you to drink what you're guilty of. He now comes in and says, I want you to understand the beast kingdom is dark. I'm going to give you a little object lesson. I'm going to bring darkness upon his kingdom. But you know what's interesting? It doesn't change anything with his followers. Verse 11 tells us that men cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, but they refused to repent of what they had done. But notice what else verse 11 says. They cursed God because of their pains and their sores. This tells us that they're still in pain from the sun burning them, and they still have their sores. So these plagues are actually overlapping each other. In other words, the sores from the first bowl don't go away when the second bowl is poured out. They are going to remain until Christ returns. So all of these people who are gathered at the valley of Jezreel, which is where Armageddon is, all of these people who are there that's going to be involved in the battle of Armageddon, they've got all of these pus-oozing sores all over them. They've got third-degree burns, and they're still cursing God. They're there from the time that was poured out all the way until Christ returns. The water that turned into blood, it's going to remain blood until Christ returns. The intense heat from the sun, it's going to remain intense until Christ returns, which implies that the darkness over the beast kingdom remains until Christ returns. Now, I do want you to understand that verses 10 and 11 can also be interpreted metaphorically. And I just want to mention that because some of you might be reading a commentary or maybe someone's book on Revelation, and it's going to refer to this as being interpreted metaphorically. In other words, that the darkness that comes over the beast in his kingdom means that their minds are blinded to the truth. And let me explain why so many scholars believe that. The Greek word for darkness is skatao, which literally means to cover with darkness. But it can also be used as a metaphor. And if it's used as a metaphor, it means to blind a person's mind to the truth. In the old days, or in John's day, they would say they were covered with a darkness, or a great darkness came upon them. And they would use the word skatao, and if they used it metaphorically, what it meant was their minds were blind to the truth. So some scholars believe that when the fifth bowl is poured out, all of the people who follow the beast, their minds become blind to the truth. From this point on, they cannot see the truth, and that's one of the main reasons why they choose to fight against the Lord at the Battle of Armageddon. Now, I don't believe that. And the reason I don't believe that is because all of the other bowls are interpreted literally. So why wouldn't the fifth bowl be interpreted literally? I believe in consistency. If I come along and I see that this first one is going to happen literally, and the second one's going to happen literally, and the third one's going to happen literally, and the fourth one's going to happen literally, what do I expect about the fifth one? That it's going to happen literally. So I want you to understand that from my perspective, I believe that the beast kingdom will experience a dense darkness. It will be God's personal testimony. And because these things are happening in either the last month or two of this tribulation, possibly just the last month, you're not talking about a long period of time. But wherever the kingdom of the beast is, it's dark. And everyone knows this has got to be from God. And if you go back and study the Egyptian plagues, they happened literally. And if you remember, there was darkness where Pharaoh and the people of Pharaoh were. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, it was not dark. God has the ability to do that. And I believe He's going to. Verse 12. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Now, as I've already said as we began this sermon, that the purpose of drying up the Euphrates River is to prepare a way for the kings of the east to move their armies to Israel in order to fight in the battle of Armageddon. Jump down to verse number 16. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Armageddon. So as you can see, the whole purpose of drying up the Euphrates River is to prepare the way for these kings to get to Israel, to take their entire army. And it's not just China, but it's all of the kings of the east, all of the kingdoms that are there. We're going to find out a little bit later that all of the kingdoms of the world are actually going to be coming to Israel to fight in this great battle known as the Battle of Armageddon. But I want you to understand, just drying up the Euphrates River is not enough. It's not enough to get the kings to actually move their armies. So, Something else is going to have to be done in order to get the kings to move their armies to Israel. They're actually going to have to be enticed to come, which brings us to verses 13 and 14. Look at verses 13 and 14. Then I saw 3 evil spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. Now notice that the word mouth, stomatos in the Greek, it's repeated 3 times. It's very important. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Now, the reason that these evil spirits are coming out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet is because they are seducing spirits. They're going to seduce the kings to follow the beast and to fight the Lord of heaven. You see, the beast and the false prophet are going to have to convince the kings of the east to come to the battle. And why are they going to have to convince the kings of the east to come to the battle? Because they're not a part of the revived Roman Empire. You see, most people don't understand that. The kingdom of the beast is the revived Roman Empire. It's those nations that are around the Mediterranean Sea. But not every nation of the world is going to be a part of the revived Roman Empire. But we do know for a time that these kings, for an hour, and what hour is that? The hour of the great day of the Lord. They're going to give their authority and their power to who? The beast. And so in order to get them to give their power and their authority to him, there's going to be seducing spirits. There's going to be demonic spirits who's going to use the words of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet to entice them to come. That's why I call them seducing spirits. They seduce the kings into bringing the armies to Israel to fight against the Lord of heaven. They seduce these kings to give him their authority and their power for 1 hour. And they do the job. These seducing spirits do exactly what they're supposed to. Verse number 14 tells us that these demonic spirits gather the kings of the whole world to Israel. Not just the kings of the east, but the kings of the whole world. And they all gather in Israel for what is known as the great battle of the Lord, the great battle of Armageddon. Verse 15. Behold, I come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays awake and keeps his clothes with him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed. Now, who's doing the talking here? If you have a red letter Bible, you know exactly who's doing the talking. What does a red letter Bible do? A red letter Bible puts the sayings of Jesus in red. So if you have a red letter Bible and I say, who's speaking here? And you look at your Bible and you see that it's written in red, you go, Jesus is speaking here. And Jesus is speaking here. So I want you to notice that this is very interesting because we're almost to the very end of the tribulation. We're getting to the grand finale. We're getting to the very end of the book. And right here in the middle of describing what's going to happen when the 6th bowl is poured out, all of a sudden Jesus interrupts the vision. This is out of context. There's no reason for this to be placed here. It doesn't go along with the vision. It has no place here. What in the world is Jesus doing? I'll tell you what he's doing. Jesus is actually warning us not to be on the earth when this happens. He's warning us not to miss the rapture. You don't want to be on the earth when all of these things are happening. So to make a dramatic impact on us, Jesus interrupts this vision. He interrupts the description of what's going to happen when the 6th bowl is poured out in order to warn us. And what is the warning? The warning is this: I am going to come like a thief. You better be ready. Because if you're not ready, you're going to be left behind. Not only are you going to be ashamed that you were left behind, but you're also going to be, in the sense of this naked being ashamed, you're also going to be without any clothing, without any protection. All of a sudden, you find yourself faced with 7 years of tribulation that you didn't have to go through. What Jesus is telling us is when you don't think that I'm coming, that's exactly when I'm going to come back for my church. And if you are not ready, these very things that we're teaching on and all of a sudden you've been engrossed in, we're talking about the first vial of God's wrath, then the second one, then the third one, then the fourth one, then the fifth one, then the sixth one. And all of us get caught up when we're talking about Armageddon. All of a sudden Jesus interrupts it and says, let me give you a warning. You're going to be right here if you're not ready when I come back for the church. And then, just as quickly as he interrupts the vision, it's over. And the vision resumes. It picks up right where it left off. Look at verse number 16. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Harma means mountain, and Ghetto, of course, was a little place. So supposedly the mountain of Megiddo. And here's what's kind of interesting. If you go to Israel with me on this trip, we'll go to Armageddon. And you'll find out that it's not a mountain at all. It's a 70-foot tail. In other words, different cities have been built upon this place. It's a very strategic place in the Jezreel Valley. If you can control Megiddo, you can control so many different places. So every king and every civilization that's been there has built a city there, and each time it got destroyed, they just built another city on top of that. But it came to be known as the mountain of Armageddon, or the mountain of Megiddo. So that's why it's called Armageddon. Now here's what's interesting. Verse 16 tells us that everything is set up at this point for the grand finale. Everything is set up at this point for Jesus Christ to return. All that is left is for the seventh bowl to be poured out, and then everything is going to fall like dominoes. And so I decided to stop right here, because next week we're going to look at the seventh bowl. And what's kind of interesting is we look at this seventh bowl, we don't understand that as soon as this thing takes place, there's going to be these things that happen. And then all of a sudden, we're going to have this battle, because the sixth bowl brought all of these kings to Israel. But we're not going to get to the Battle of Armageddon until chapter 19. Because chapters 17 and 18 are kind of like an appendix, or an end note, to kind of fill you in on everything so you know what's been happening and what happens as these things occur.